They mocked his stupid farmer trick until he blew up 2 Panzers in 11 seconds. April 9th, 1945. Northern Germany. The forest east of Osnabrück was cold and damp that morning, thick with fog that clung to the trees and reduced visibility to a few dozen meters. The 84th Infantry Division moved along a narrow logging road, advancing cautiously through the Teutoburg forest. The division's task was straightforward on paper: push east, secure the ridgelines, and link up with armored elements moving north. In reality, the terrain worked against them. The road was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. The ditches were deep with runoff from the spring thaw, and the trees formed a barrier that prevented any meaningful maneuvering. Private Caleb Turner walked with the 3rd Squad of the lead platoon, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth at the road's edge. He kept his rifle low, scanning the tree line. Caleb was 22, quiet by nature, and noticeably more observant than most of the other riflemen. He came from a small family farm outside Ottumwa, Iowa, where he had spent his childhood and teenage years handling cattle, repairing equipment, and managing work that required patience and careful attention to detail. His background gave him a habit of studying his surroundings more thoroughly than others. It was not something the Army taught him. It was simply how he understood the world. Caleb had been with the division since the Rhineland campaign. He was not known for bold behavior or aggressive action. He simply followed orders, kept his gear ready, and stayed calm under pressure. His squad leader, Sergeant Donovan, appreciated Caleb's reliability, even if he did not always understand some of Caleb's improvised techniques. Caleb sometimes practiced timing drills or strange movements during downtime, using crates, stones, or branches to test weight shifts or angles. The others joked about it, calling it his stupid farmer trick, which Caleb never bothered defending or explaining. That morning, the column slowed as a runner came down the line whispering quick updates. German armor had been heard ahead. Engines, heavy ones. The information spread rapidly, and every man understood what that meant. Tanks inside a forest were a serious threat. The division's Sherman tanks were still a long distance behind, delayed by road obstructions. If German Panzers pushed toward this narrow corridor, the riflemen would have only seconds to react. Sergeant Donovan raised his hand for the squad to disperse into cover. The men moved to the ditches and tree trunks on either side of the road. They were trained for this scenario, but few felt confident. The fog made it impossible to see far, and the sound of engines carried strangely between the trees, making it difficult to determine direction or distance. Donovan's task was to hold the lead position on the road until ordered otherwise, prevent the Germans from breaking through, and buy time for the rest of the battalion to reposition further west. Caleb crouched behind a fallen pine tree beside the road, pressing one hand into the wet soil. He listened more than he watched. The engine noise grew louder and clearer, rhythmic, grinding, unmistakably a tracked vehicle. A Panzer IV, he guessed, maybe 2. The way the sound fluctuated suggested that the vehicles were adjusting throttle frequently, likely navigating the same tight bends the Americans had just crossed. Caleb studied the ground in front of him. A shallow rut angled across the road where water had eroded the soil. To the right, a thick spruce trunk had fallen partly into the ditch, wedged firmly against the embankment. Most of the squad saw it as debris. Caleb recognized something else. On the farm, he had learned how large objects behaved under weight: wagons, cattle, machinery. The way they shifted, the way they corrected themselves when forced into confined paths. He noted how the tank would likely react when its right track hit that rut. Donovan crawled beside him and whispered, "If they come around that bend, we fall back. Bazooka team will take the first shot if they get a clean line." There was little confidence in his voice. The fog made a clean line nearly impossible. Caleb continued observing the terrain. He reached into his pack and pulled out a satchel charge, an explosive normally carried by engineers, but occasionally distributed to infantry when clearing obstacles. He had kept one since the winter, unsure when he might need it. Donovan noticed and frowned. "What are you doing with that?" he hissed. Caleb kept his eyes on the bend in the road. "If the first tank hits the rut, it will lift slightly on the right side," he whispered. "Just for a moment. And Donovan asked, confused and tense. That's when it's vulnerable. Donovan shook his head. Turner, listen to me. Tanks are not cattle. You keep your head down until I give the order. But Caleb had already begun calculating distances and timing in his mind. The approach speed, the angle of the road, the weight distribution. He could visualize how the tank would move as clearly as he once pictured a stubborn bull pushing through a narrow chute. The first Panzer appeared through the fog a moment later. Mud was caked on its tracks, its turrets scanning in slow arcs, the commander standing exposed in the cupola with binoculars in hand. The tank advanced steadily, its engine straining as it maneuvered through the tight forest path. Caleb's breathing slowed. Every detail mattered now. The tank rolled closer, its right track aimed directly toward the rut. Donovan whispered urgently, Turner, stay down. That's an order. But Caleb stepped out of the ditch, keeping low. His squad mates watched him in disbelief. He waited beside the fallen spruce trunk, the satchel charge in his right hand. The Panzer hit the rut. Its right side dipped. The weight shifted exactly as Caleb expected. He moved. With one quick motion, he slid the charge beneath the angled spruce trunk and stepped back into the ditch. The fuse burned rapidly beneath the wood. The commander began shouting. The driver tried to correct. The tank's weight shifted fully onto the trunk. The charge detonated. The explosion struck upward, using the trunk as leverage. The blast slammed into the underside of the Panzer, where its armor was thinnest. The tank jerked violently. Flames burst from the engine vents. The vehicle skidded sideways, losing control. The men of the squad stared, stunned, as the Panzer ground to a halt, smoke pouring from its hull. Caleb exhaled once, steady and controlled, before preparing for whatever would come next. The explosion from the first Panzer had not yet faded when the forest filled with new engine noise. Another tank was close behind, moving too quickly to stop. The fog hid the wreck for several seconds longer, giving the second vehicle no time to adjust. Its commander had probably assumed the road was clear, expecting only small arms resistance. The Germans had used the forest roads frequently during the retreat, and many of their crews believed American infantry would avoid direct confrontation without armor support. Caleb kept his position near the ditch, breathing steadily as he watched the smoke rise from the first tank. The blast had disabled it completely. Flames flickered through gaps in the hull, and the turret stopped moving. The crew either escaped quickly or was incapacitated inside. The important detail was that the road was now blocked. The second Panzer would be forced to slow down or attempt to maneuver around the wreck. Sergeant Donovan crawled toward Caleb, shock still visible on his face. "Turner, what did you just do?" he whispered. The squad leader's voice shook slightly, a mixture of disbelief and adrenaline. Caleb did not respond. He was listening to the engine of the second tank, paying attention to the RPM fluctuations. The vehicle was accelerating too hard, unaware that the road ahead was no longer passable. The men in the platoon tightened their grips on their rifles. Bazooka teams tried again to find a firing angle, but the trees left no openings. The disabled Panzer filled the center of the road, leaving only narrow gaps on either side, each too small for a clean shot. The men exchanged tense looks. If the second tank managed to push past the wreck, the platoon would be forced into a chaotic retreat through the trees. Caleb examined the burning Panzer's position and noted how the explosion had shifted it. The rear of the tank rested at a slight angle, leaving a shallow space beneath the hull where debris, fuel lines, and support brackets were exposed. It was a vulnerable point, one that existed only because of the way the first blast had knocked the vehicle sideways. The second Panzer finally emerged through the fog. The driver saw the disabled wreck too late. The tank braked hard, its tracks grinding against the muddy road. The turret rotated sharply as the crew tried to identify the threat. The commander shouted to his gunner and driver, his voice rising above the engine noise. The sudden stop left the Panzer slightly misaligned, angled toward the left ditch with its right side exposed. Caleb looked toward Corporal Hensley, who was crouched behind a nearby tree. Hensley carried a second satchel charge. He held it close to his chest, clearly unsure what to do after witnessing the first explosion. Caleb extended his hand silently. Hensley stared at him for a moment, then passed the charge without argument. The soldier's earlier skepticism had vanished completely. Sergeant Donovan whispered urgently, "Turner, stay down. Don't move. The next tank is alert now. They know someone is close." But Caleb did not alter his expression. He was focused on the tank's angle, the height of its hull, and the exposed section created by the first wreck. He moved quickly but stayed low, using the burning Panzer as cover. The heat radiating from the damaged machine forced him to keep his face turned slightly away. The second tank's turret shifted toward his side of the road, but the narrow angle prevented it from depressing the gun enough to fire. Caleb was aware of the risk. He did not hesitate. He reached the disabled Panzer and positioned himself behind its rear tread. The second tank's engine roared as the crew attempted to reverse, but the narrow road and unstable ground made it difficult. The tank rocked slightly as the driver corrected the angle. Caleb used those few seconds to slide the second satchel charge into the exposed space beneath the wrecked vehicle. His movements were precise and controlled. He pressed the charge deeper using a broken metal bracket from the damaged tank's underside. Fuel dripped quietly from a ruptured line above. He pulled the fuse. The second Panzer's commander spotted him and shouted. The turret snapped toward the wreck. Caleb immediately retreated behind the burning tank, keeping his body tight to the ground. The explosion erupted beneath the first Panzer's hull, using the destroyed vehicle as a shield and a weapon simultaneously. Flames burst outward, and a violent shockwave hit the second tank's forward armor, damaging its suspension and cracking the weld seams along its lower plate. Fire shot through the gaps in the German vehicle's hull. The engine stalled. The turret froze mid-rotation. For a moment, only the sound of burning fuel filled the forest. Then everything went silent. The second Panzer remained motionless, its engine no longer responding. Smoke rose in steady columns from the seams around the hull. The crew inside made no attempt to exit. The tank had been neutralized. 11 seconds separated the first explosion from the second. The squad looked on in disbelief. No one spoke. Even Donovan, who had shouted orders moments earlier, seemed unable to form words. The entire platoon had expected a defensive retreat, heavy casualties, or even a full halt in their advance. Instead, they watched a quiet farm boy from Iowa destroy 2 German tanks in a place where infantry doctrine offered almost no solutions. Caleb finally stepped back from the burning wrecks and adjusted the strap of his helmet. He did not react to the stunned faces around him. To him, the sequence had been clear: identify the angles, understand the machine's corrections, and use the environment to create leverage. He had grown up doing similar calculations on the farm, though never under such conditions. Donovan approached him slowly. His voice was softer now. "Turner, how did you know that would work?" Caleb looked toward the burning tanks, then back at his squad leader. "I didn't know," he said calmly, "but I knew how they would move." The smoke from the 2 disabled Panzers drifted through the forest in uneven columns, spreading slowly between the trees. The blast had shaken loose clumps of damp soil and scattered fragments of metal across the narrow logging road. The sounds of combat did not continue. There was no counterattack, no machine gun fire, no German infantry charging through the trees. Everything settled into an abrupt stillness that felt unnatural to the men who had braced for a prolonged fight. Sergeant Donovan stayed, crouched behind a tree, for several seconds before standing fully. His hands rested on his web gear, his eyes fixed on the wrecks, as if waiting for the tanks to move again. They did not. Flames inside the first Panzer began to quiet, leaving only a persistent crackle. The second tank produced a gray, steady plume from its engine compartment. The platoon cautiously emerged from cover. Bazooka teams held their launchers ready, but lowered them slightly when it became clear no further vehicles were coming. A few men crossed the road, stepping around the debris. Others approached the wrecks, but kept a safe distance, aware that ammunition inside a burning tank could still ignite. Caleb Turner remained where he was for a moment, breathing steadily, his hands still covered in dirt and soot. He watched the second tank until he was certain it was no longer operational. His movements lacked any visible excitement or triumph. He behaved as if he had simply completed a necessary task and was now waiting for the next set of instructions. Hensley approached him first. The corporal, who had handed Caleb the second satchel charge, stared at the wrecks with disbelief. "Turner, I don't understand how you even—" He stopped speaking, searching for the right words. "Nobody does that. Nobody runs at a Panzer in the open." Caleb brushed ash from his sleeve. "It wasn't the open," he said quietly. "The first one blocked their line of sight." His explanation was technical, simple, and free of any dramatic framing. He focused on the mechanics and angles rather than the danger. Hensley nodded slowly, still processing what he had seen. More soldiers gathered around. Some looked at Caleb with a mixture of surprise and caution, unsure how to address what had just happened. Others avoided eye contact altogether, shaken by the intensity of the moment. Sergeant Donovan finally stepped toward Caleb. His expression was firm, but there was a noticeable shift in the way he addressed him. "You saved the entire platoon," he said. His voice lacked its usual forceful tone. "You didn't just knock out tanks. You stopped a breakthrough." Caleb did not respond immediately. He studied the damage suspension on the second Panzer, noting how the blast from beneath the first wreck had transferred force into the tank's vulnerable lower hull. After a few seconds, he finally spoke. "I used what was in front of me," he said. "Nothing else would have worked in this terrain." Donovan took in the answer. "Still," he said, "that was more than luck. You read the ground in a way most men can't." Caleb shifted his weight slightly. "I grew up around heavy equipment," he said, "and around animals that didn't like being moved. They teach you how things behave when they shift their weight." Donovan exhaled slowly, not fully understanding the comparison, but accepting it nonetheless. A medic team arrived and surveyed the area. There were no American casualties. The squad had expected a disaster: crushed positions, broken defensive lines, or the loss of half their men. Instead, they were standing, intact, staring at two burning tanks that less than a minute earlier had threatened to halt their entire advance. Lieutenant Harris, the platoon commander, arrived shortly afterward. His arrival produced a different atmosphere. Officers rarely saw events exactly as soldiers did, and Harris walked straight to the wrecks, scanning them with a stern, evaluative expression. "Report," he said. Donovan explained the sequence. Two Panzers advancing, no anti-tank angle, and one rifleman creating an improvised trap using terrain and timing. Harris listened without interruption. When Donovan finished, the lieutenant turned to Caleb. "Private Turner," he said, "did you plan this ahead of time?" Caleb shook his head. "No, sir. I recognized the rut and the trunk. The tank corrected its weight the moment it hit the dip. That gave me a window." Harris studied him carefully. "You understood the precise moment a Panzer would be most vulnerable." "Yes, sir," Caleb answered. "That's how machines behave when they lose balance." The lieutenant continued evaluating him. "And the second tank? Was that also part of your plan?" "No, sir," Caleb said. "But the angle of the first wreck created an exposed gap underneath. It was the only place the charge would reach something critical." Harris looked at the ground, then at the destroyed tanks. After a long pause, he said only, "Remarkable." He did not elaborate. Officers in combat often avoided praising improvisation too openly. It encouraged behavior that could easily turn fatal. But the tone of his voice carried respect. More soldiers approached, gathering around Donovan and Caleb. Questions circulated quietly. How close had he been? How did he stay calm? How did he know what would happen? Caleb gave short answers when pressed, but avoided expanding on details. He did not enjoy the attention. His focus remained on the road ahead. Engineers finally arrived, tasked with assessing whether the wrecks could be moved or if explosives were needed to clear the path. One engineer crouched beside the first tank, studying the twisted metal beneath the hull. "This isn't normal satchel placement," he muttered. "What did you boys do, drop a tree on it?" Donovan shook his head. "Something like that." The engineer looked at Caleb with curiosity. "You're the one who set these charges?" he asked. Caleb nodded once. "Well," the engineer said, standing, "I've seen tanks taken out every way you can imagine, but not like this." Caleb didn't react. He simply stepped back toward his squad, ready to move as soon as orders came. The lieutenant gathered the platoon and announced the next objective. They would continue advancing east, using the time bought by the destruction of the armored spearhead. The road had to be cleared quickly. Higher command expected momentum. The Germans were retreating, but even retreating forces could inflict severe damage if given the opportunity. As the platoon prepared to move, several soldiers glanced at Caleb again. Not with mockery now, but with something closer to respect. The stupid farmer trick was no longer a joke. It had been the difference between a stalled offensive and a continued push toward the Weser River. Caleb adjusted the straps on his pack, checked his rifle, and fell back into formation. He did not smile. He did not boast. He simply returned to the quiet posture he always carried, ready to do the next task asked of him. Behind them, the two Panzers continued to burn, marking the place where an ordinary farm boy had outthought machines designed for dominance. The platoon resumed its slow movement through the forest once the immediate danger had passed. The engineers worked behind them to clear the road, using axes, chains, and small charges to shift the disabled Panzers enough for the column to proceed. The men of the 84th Infantry Division advanced cautiously, aware that the destruction of the tanks did not guarantee safety. German forces in retreat often left scattered infantry groups, snipers, or concealed anti-tank teams along these narrow forest routes. Caleb Turner walked near the middle of the squad now, no longer at the forward edge. Sergeant Donovan had quietly repositioned him, not out of punishment, but because the squad leader wanted to ensure Caleb had support if another threat appeared. Donovan did not say this openly, but his tone had shifted. He spoke to Caleb with more weight, more care, and with the awareness that the quiet private had just altered the momentum of their advance. The forest began to change as they moved east. The trees thinned slightly, allowing short bursts of daylight to filter through the canopy. Patches of open ground appeared between clusters of pines. In these areas, the men spread out again, keeping distance between each rifleman. The ground was uneven and covered with new spring growth, low bushes, ferns, and grass that had forced their way through the cold soil. The air carried a strong smell of sap and damp bark. The lieutenant signaled for a halt when they reached a rise overlooking a shallow depression. He unfolded a map against his leg and scanned the area with binoculars. The platoon's task remained the same: advance through the forest, secure the far side of the ridge, and prevent any German rearguard force from establishing a delaying position. If the Germans managed to fortify the next clearing, the entire battalion would be delayed for hours. Donovan moved among his men, checking their positions, reminding them to stay low and watch the tree line. When he reached Caleb, he paused. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. Caleb nodded. "I'm fine, Sergeant. You did something significant back there," Donovan said, keeping his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. Most men would still be shaking. "You look like you stepped off a tractor." Caleb's expression didn't change. It was the only solution that made sense. Donovan studied him for a moment. "Just remember something," he said. "What you did worked once. Don't assume it'll work every time. Tanks, terrain, luck, none of it behaves consistently out here." Caleb nodded again. He understood. He wasn't searching for another opportunity to repeat the maneuver. He simply recognized that circumstances had aligned in a way he could use. If they did not align again, he would not attempt anything similar. The lieutenant finished his scan of the area and signaled the platoon forward once more. They descended the rise and entered the shallow depression. The terrain grew softer underfoot, the soil dark and saturated from recent rains. The forest thickened ahead, forming a natural choke point where visibility dropped sharply. As they approached this narrow corridor, Hensley whispered to the squad, "Feels like another trap waiting to happen." His tone carried the memory of the tanks still burning behind them. Caleb glanced at the corridor, but did not show concern. He studied the ground, indentations in the soil, broken branches at irregular intervals, and the way the moss had been disturbed on several tree trunks. To him, these signs indicated recent movement, but not heavy machinery. Infantry, most likely. Maybe a small German patrol moving west. The point man raised a fist, signaling a halt. The platoon dropped to one knee. The forest was quiet, but the kind of quiet that made men uneasy. No birds, no distant movement, no wind through the upper branches. Lieutenant Harris advanced carefully to the forward position. He motioned for Caleb to join him along with Donovan. "You've got an eye for terrain," Harris said. "Take a look at this." Caleb observed the corridor more closely. The ground was too narrow for vehicles, and the soil was soft enough to hold clear footprints, though none were new. He crouched, placing a hand on the ground, and traced the impressions left behind. 2 hours old, he said. 5 or 6 men, moving fast. Donovan raised an eyebrow. "You can tell that from this?" "Yes, Sergeant," Caleb said. "The footprints haven't pooled with water, so they're recent. And they're shallow, meaning they were moving quickly, not carrying heavy loads." Harris nodded. "Likely a German rearguard patrol. Could be scouts." Caleb pointed slightly to the right. They left the corridor and moved up that slope. They adjusted course to stay off the road. The lieutenant followed his line of sight. "Good. That means we avoid that slope entirely." He signaled the platoon to shift left, bypassing the narrow corridor. The men moved quietly through the trees, maintaining spacing and watching for signs of ambush. Every few minutes, Donovan checked on Caleb, not because he doubted him, but because he understood that the squad treated Caleb differently now. There was tension, respect mixed with uncertainty. Some men felt safer around him. Others felt nervous, unsure whether he would take another sudden risk. As they advanced, Caleb noticed something ahead, a break in the trees where the forest opened into a small clearing. Through the gap, he saw the faint outline of abandoned German equipment, a damaged ammunition cart, a broken field telephone line, and scattered ration tins. These were signs of retreat, not defense. The Germans had moved quickly, likely abandoning the area after realizing their tanks would not hold the road. Caleb signaled Donovan and pointed toward the clearing. Donovan squinted through the gap. "Looks empty." But we approached slow. The platoon spread out again, weapons raised, eyes scanning every dark gap between the trunks. They moved in steady formation until they reached the edge of the clearing. The space was empty. No bodies, no fresh tracks, no signs of artillery or heavy weapons. Only abandoned equipment and footprints leading east. The lieutenant ordered a short halt. The men took the opportunity to drink water, adjust their gear, and prepare for the next leg of the advance. Caleb sat on a fallen log, resting his rifle across his lap. He felt no sense of victory about the tank engagement, only relief that his squad had survived. As he sat there, a realization formed quietly in the minds of the men around him. Before the morning's encounter, Caleb Turner had been just another infantryman. Now he was someone they watched more closely, someone whose instincts had proven reliable in a moment where standard tactics had failed. Whether Caleb accepted that role or not didn't matter. The squad had already begun seeing him differently. And in the hours ahead, that shift would influence every decision the platoon made as they moved deeper into the forest. The platoon remained in the clearing for only a few minutes before Lieutenant Harris received updated orders over the field radio. Higher command wanted the ridge secured before nightfall. German forces were believed to be regrouping in scattered pockets beyond the forest, and the division needed to prevent any organized counterattack or delaying action. The lieutenant folded his map, gathered Donovan and the squad leaders, and outlined the next phase. Move east toward a second clearing, establish temporary control, and prepare for the battalion's mechanized support to link up once the road behind them was cleared. The men stood and tightened their gear. Exhaustion pushed at them, but none spoke complaints. Momentum mattered now, and everyone understood the importance of maintaining pressure on the retreating German units. The destruction of the 2 Panzers had opened a path that might otherwise have been blocked for hours. Caleb Turner fell into formation without comment. His hands were still stained with soot, and dried mud clung to his sleeves. Hensley walked beside him, but kept stealing glances as if trying to understand the quiet soldier who had done something few infantrymen would ever attempt. Caleb did not acknowledge the attention. His focus remained on the terrain ahead and the tasks that still needed to be done. The platoon advanced again, moving deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser as they approached the next rise, and the ground became increasingly uneven. Moss-covered roots protruded from the soil, slowing their pace. The air was thicker here, and the smell of damp earth was stronger. Every sound echoed differently, making it difficult to distinguish between natural forest noise and potential movement from German patrols. Halfway up the slope, the point man raised his fist. The platoon dropped instantly into defensive positions. Lieutenant Harris moved forward with Donovan and Caleb to assess what had caused the halt. The point man pointed toward a cluster of trees on the ridge. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but Caleb studied the ground carefully. He noticed disturbed pine needles, fresh impressions in the soil, and broken branches in a narrow pattern leading downslope. "A group moved through here recently," he said quietly. 7, maybe 8 men. Armed. Light equipment only. Harris nodded. "Potential scouts." Caleb continued examining the signs. They weren't rushing. Footprints are evenly spaced. They had a purpose. He pointed toward the direction the tracks led. They went to the ridge. "Stop there." Then moved east. Donovan exhaled sharply. They were watching us. The lieutenant considered this for a moment, then issued orders for the platoon to widen their formation. If German scouts had observed the American movement, it meant a rearguard unit or small defensive line could be assembling ahead. The men resumed their advance, this time with more deliberate spacing. Weapons remained raised, and conversation dropped to near silence. The only sounds came from boots on soft earth and the distant tapping of woodpeckers somewhere deeper in the forest. The trees thinned as they approached the ridge. Harris signaled for another halt, and the platoon fanned out along the crest, scanning the area below. The terrain beyond the ridge was more open, a broad slope that led down into a second clearing, larger than the first. From his vantage point, Caleb could see abandoned equipment scattered across the far side. A broken mortar tube, a partially collapsed supply crate, and tracks from several infantry squads who had moved hastily east. Donovan studied the scene through his binoculars. "Looks like they cleared out not long ago." Caleb agreed. "Footprints are fresh. They left in formation. That means officers were still directing them." Hensley leaned in. "Think they're regrouping further east?" Caleb answered without hesitation. "Yes." They weren't running. They were repositioning. The lieutenant listened to Caleb's assessment and adjusted the platoon's formation accordingly. The squad leaders spread their men along the ridge, assigning fields of fire and sectors to watch. The goal was to secure the area long enough for the rest of the company to arrive. The squad dug shallow defensive positions using entrenching tools. Soil flew in small clumps as they carved out depressions behind logs and tree roots. Caleb worked quietly but efficiently, shaping a low firing position that gave him a clear line of sight toward the clearing below. As they settled into place, engineer teams finally caught up with the platoon. They approached Caleb and Donovan, wanting to examine the aftermath of the earlier tank destruction. One of them, a staff sergeant experienced in battlefield damage assessment, crouched beside Caleb and spoke quietly. "I looked at those wrecks," he said. "That wasn't luck. That was precision." He paused. "Where'd you learn to do something like that?" Caleb kept his eyes on the clearing as he answered. "I didn't learn it anywhere specific. I just recognized how the tank shifted its weight." The engineer nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, whatever you saw, it bought this whole battalion more time than you realize." When the engineer moved on, Donovan approached Caleb once more. "You understand something, Turner," he said. "What you did changed the operation today. But I won't let anyone push you into trying something reckless again. You did it because the situation demanded it. That moment is over." Caleb acknowledged the words with a small nod. He understood the concern. He wasn't interested in becoming a symbol or an example. He wasn't seeking recognition or roles that didn't fit him. He had simply acted because the terrain gave him an opening. The platoon remained on the ridge for nearly an hour, maintaining watch. During that time, several soldiers approached Caleb, not directly to praise him, but out of a need to understand the soldier who had taken an extraordinary action with such calmness. Some asked small, practical questions about the satchel charge or the positioning of the 1st Panzer. Others asked nothing at all. They simply stood near him, reassured by his presence. As the battalion prepared to move again, Lieutenant Harris received confirmation that German forces had established a makeshift line further east. Their task remained unchanged: advance, secure, and prevent a rearguard stand. Caleb stood, brushed dirt from his uniform, and checked his gear once more. The men saw his steady movements and found themselves more grounded. The forest ahead remained uncertain, but the effect of Caleb's actions lingered. He had not asked for leadership. He did not seek attention. But in the minds of the men around him, the quiet farm boy had become the steady center of the squad, someone who could read the battlefield in ways they could not. And as they prepared to move again, it was clear that everyone, including Donovan and Harris, kept one eye forward and one eye on Caleb Turner. The battalion resumed its advance before midday, pushing deeper into the forest as the terrain gradually descended toward the open farmland east of the ridge. The destruction of the two Panzers had removed the immediate armored threat, but no one expected the rest of the day to be easy. Retreating German forces often regrouped quickly, forming small defensive pockets that could slow an entire company for hours. The lieutenant kept the platoon moving with caution, halting every few hundred meters to reassess the ground and maintain coordination with the units on their flanks. Caleb Turner marched with the squad, his rifle held in a relaxed but ready position. He moved without hesitation, but also without the visible tension seen in many of the other men. The sound of distant artillery rumbled occasionally from the east, too far to pose immediate danger, but close enough to remind the platoon that the conflict ahead was still active. The forest floor shifted beneath their boots, alternating between patches of soft mud and areas of compacted soil. The air remained cool, though the sun had begun to burn away the remaining fog, leaving streaks of light between the branches. Around mid-afternoon, the platoon reached the edge of the forest. They emerged from the trees into a wide field that sloped gently downward toward a cluster of old farm buildings, stone walls, collapsed roofs, and broken fences that marked a property abandoned earlier in the war. The structures showed signs of shelling and small arms fire. Roof tiles lay scattered across the ground, and shredded wooden beams protruded from the rubble. Lieutenant Harris signaled for the platoon to halt. He and Donovan studied the farmstead through binoculars, searching for movement. It was common for German rearguard units to occupy abandoned farms, using the stone walls as defensive positions. The lieutenant directed the squads to spread out along the tree line and observe before advancing. Caleb lay prone beside a moss-covered stump and scanned the buildings carefully. He noticed broken footprints in the soil near the closest structure, older impressions that had dried and cracked. He also saw more recent tracks near a pile of debris on the far side of the courtyard. These prints were deeper, sharper, and more defined. Someone had moved through there recently, likely within the last hour. Donovan crawled beside him. "You seeing anything we should worry about?" Caleb pointed subtly. "Footprints near that broken fence. Fresh. 5 men, maybe 6. They were moving toward the road on the far side." The sergeant studied the area. "Patrol or retreating unit?" "Retreating," Caleb answered. "Their spacing is consistent." They weren't searching, they were relocating. Harris conferred with the squad leaders and decided the platoon would advance cautiously toward the farm, clear the area, and then wait for the rest of the company to arrive. The battalion needed the farmstead to secure the approach route for vehicles moving out of the forest. The platoon advanced at a low crouch, rifles raised. They entered the courtyard in small groups, checking windows, doorways, and collapsed structures. The air smelled of old smoke and rotting timber. Birds scattered from the ruined buildings as the soldiers moved through the area. The main farmhouse had suffered the worst damage. Its roof had caved inward from artillery fire, and pieces of shattered masonry lay everywhere. Caleb approached a broken doorway and paused. Inside the room, he saw overturned furniture, scattered papers, and an empty German ration tin lying near the fireplace. He moved inside, careful not to disturb the debris. The others followed, clearing each room systematically. Nothing indicated an ambush or defensive position. The building had been used briefly and then abandoned. As the platoon regrouped outside, Donovan gave the order to secure the perimeter. Men took positions along the courtyard walls while others searched the surrounding fields for signs of movement. Caleb stood beside the stone fence and observed the ground once more. His attention fixed on a dirt path leading away from the farm, narrow, uneven, and lined with broken wagon tracks. Footprints marked the path in a pattern he recognized immediately, the same spacing and direction as the ones he saw earlier. The Germans were moving east, not falling apart. They were reorganizing. Caleb relayed the observation to Donovan, who brought it to the lieutenant. Harris listened carefully, then looked at the eastern horizon. If they're regrouping, they're preparing for a final stand outside the forest, he said. They'll want to slow us before we reach the open ground. The lieutenant issued instructions for the platoon to hold their position until reinforcements arrived. The farmstead became a temporary strongpoint, with soldiers establishing watch positions and improving their makeshift cover. The engineers reached the area shortly afterward, marking the route for the incoming Shermans and half-tracks that would push out of the forest by evening. As the activity continued around him, Caleb sat briefly on a fallen beam near the courtyard's edge. His hands were steady, but his expression carried fatigue, not from fear, but from the weight of the day's events. Hensley sat beside him, resting his helmet on his knee. You know, Hensley said quietly, they're going to talk about what you did for a long time. Caleb didn't look at him. They don't need to. Maybe not, Hensley replied, but they will anyway. Caleb continued watching the path that led east. In his mind, the two destroyed tanks were already behind him. He wasn't thinking about recognition or credit or anything beyond the task in front of him. He had acted because he needed to, because he saw an opening, because the alternative had meant losing men he had marched beside for months. He did not consider it heroism. He saw it as problem-solving in a place where problems got people killed if ignored. As the sun lowered behind the forest, the platoon prepared to move again. Orders arrived. The battalion would advance at first light, supported by armor. The final pockets of German resistance were expected somewhere beyond the next ridge. Caleb stood, pulled on his helmet, and tightened his gear. He joined his squad as they formed up in the open field. The men glanced at him with the same quiet respect they had shown since the morning. It was not admiration. It was trust built on what they had witnessed, trust that came from someone who had kept them alive through calm judgment and precise action. Caleb Turner did not notice the way they looked at him, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. He simply prepared to walk forward into whatever the forest and the next day would bring.